3 years in your tenure as a first female chief executive, and we've talked about some of the impact and some of the some of the wins that you've had, and the mission that you're on. You've not always been that CEO. Obviously, there's a life prior to UVAC, and sometimes when people see you on stage, and I've seen you, talk about passionately, like you do, with some of the challenges and so forth, and people identify you very closely as that expert, that sector, that sort of subject matter expertise that you have within this niche area. But I want to talk a little bit about the journey that got you here, some of those sort of key moments. Obviously, you've done a sort of doctorate in this arena as well. So talk to us a little bit about that. Talk to us really prior to joining UVAC. What was that like? I know that you were a civil servant, so a little bit about that, if you can, please,
Yes.
in your own words.
Well, I mean, I was a public servant, really, from the moment I graduated.
Yeah.
I spent 10 years as a labour market researcher, labour market economist, working in a particular sort of, geography. So I worked for the Leaders Development Agency for 10 years, researching small area economies, observing two-speed economies in terms of economic growth, but the locking out of local people from local jobs. And I was acutely aware at that time that I was kind of constrained in my role around what I could and couldn't say, for example, but also increasingly sort of, interested in how I could impact and affect change by working in partnership and in close relationship with particular stakeholders. And I was very happy in that role. And actually moving out of economic development, because I was an economic development practitioner first, into skills was quite revealing, because as an economic development practitioner in the 90s, when economies were changing, local areas were kind of moving out of traditional industries, manufacturing, engineering, and into public sector services and professional services, training was something that happened somewhere other than in economic development. In fact, they were kind of running sort of in parallel to each other. But when I moved to the Learning and Skills Council in the early noughties, it became very apparent to me that skills were a key determinant of economic success, and therefore not having a proper conversation in the round around actually the role of skills and basic skills and growth in sort of, the development of skills, then actually we're never going to achieve equality of opportunity for people who were necessarily locked out of those local opportunities. So I spent, again, another almost 14 years happily working in skills policy. Again, very recognisably, I formed alliances and coalitions with people who I thought could support me in the policy work that I did around first basic skills. I led national basic skills policy and regional basic skills policy. So looking at skills for life as an aspirational, as a positive, as opposed to a deficit sort of thing that people could do to enhance and sort of support their own ambitions in work. And then I moved into a sphere of work that I thought was just one supply side solution. So I moved into working with the apprenticeship policy sphere. And I honestly thought, well, what are apprenticeships? I had no idea what they were when I first took on the role leading higher apprenticeship growth, because the coalition government back in 2010-11 invested £25 million in developing new apprenticeship frameworks at the time in level 4 and level 5 provision. And I was convinced that it was just, one solution to the problem around low skill, low productivity. But I soon became enchanted by this concept of an apprenticeship and what it could mean in terms of stretching the system out of those traditional craft and trade roles and into something that was more technical, professional. And so I worked with employers, and I worked with sector skills councils at the time, going back some years, to kind of examine how the system could be reformed to recognise employer ambition and, in fact, university ambition to deliver more in apprenticeships. At the time, the funding wasn't equal. There was no recognition of the role that universities play in terms of devising a programme, an HE programme that could deliver the skills and competences that really university qualifications were seen as being far too academic, that they couldn't actually fulfill the requirements of the criteria for apprenticeships. So I really kind of moved fairly and squarely into the policy domain that was apprenticeships, and I built a very successful career on it. You know, if I think that actually all the things that I did in government, if I look at my own doctoral thesis, I termed it gamekeeper turned poacher, because I was reflecting at my development as a practitioner in government, working with universities and with, those influencers to create the space that got the recognition that actually universities had a role in developing and designing and delivering a new sort of reformed apprenticeship program. And then after government, where I became working more closely with universities and higher education institutions as an advisor, as a consultant, as the director of policy and operations for the University Vocational Awards Council. So really it was kind of contrasting my sphere of influence and how I operated. Now, clearly, when you're operating as a civil servant, you're constrained in terms of policy design development by the politicians who determine the direction of policy. But actually, I was always able to operate outside of some of those constraints because of the strength of my relationships. And I recognised very early on that universities, particularly some of the thought leaders, the leaders in universities that saw an opportunity for them to enter a new programme, I worked with them very closely. I harnessed their ambition and their leadership qualities to actually allow me to do my job successfully in government. And I remember somebody who eventually became my doctoral supervisor, who was still a good friend and mentor. He said, "Have you ever thought about working in higher education?" To which I said, "No." I said, "No, I'm a very happy civil servant. I love the work that I do. I'm convinced by my mission and vision. I have a role here." But actually, he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, which was I could be effective in the way that I'd been effective in government. I could be effective out of government, working strategically with universities and higher education stakeholders. And that's what I've done ever since.
Canny Conversation Podcast Series 5 by Safaraz Ali.